Okay, hello everybody, and thanks for joining us in this latest series of Basis Technologies webinars on DevOps and test automation for SAP. As you can see on the screen there, today we're going to be taking a slightly different view, and we're going to be looking a little bit in from the outside and talking about what DevOps professionals need to know about the world of SAP and how they should be thinking about SAP in their day-to-day goings-on. Little bit of a webinar admin before we start the session, as is always the case. Everybody in the session is on mute, but we would encourage you to submit any questions through the question box in the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll do our best to get to some of those at the end of the session. We're going to aim to run for probably about 45 minutes today. We are also recording today's session, and we will send a link to the recording to everybody who's registered for the webinar. So if you do want to see that, to watch anything back or share it with colleagues, and you don't receive the link in the next day or two, do please get in touch. There'll be some details at the end, or you can do that via our website as well. So let's get on with today's session. Just first of all, some introductions in terms of our speakers. So my name is Peter Yabsley. I'm the head of product marketing here at Basis Technologies, and regular webinar attendees among you will have heard my voice before on a number of these sessions, and the same can be said for my colleague who's joining us, James Roberts, who's our Chief Technology Officer at Basis Technologies, and James is going to take us through the main part of today's presentation. James, thanks for joining us.
You're very welcome, Pete, and yeah, good to be here. Hello, everybody.
And finally, I'm delighted to say that we've got a guest with us on today's session as well. Nicole Alsterlot, who's the Enterprise Change and Release Manager at Columbia Sportswear, is also joining us on the call today. And we're going to talk to Nicole a bit later on in today's session about her experience and Columbia Sportswear's experience of bringing DevOps into their company, and also the impact that's having on SAP and how they manage their system. So Nicole, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's take a quick look at today's agenda before we begin the session. What we're going to cover at a high level, we're going to look at why DevOps professionals should care about SAP. We know that maybe it's not in the forefront of everybody's mind outside of the world of SAP, and James is going to dig into this in some more detail and look at why it should matter not only to SAP professionals and the SAP technical experts out there, but to a broader group as well. We're going to look at why DevOps in SAP is a bit different and a bit unique, and what we need to consider around that when we're thinking about DevOps in SAP as opposed to other parts of the IT world. We're going to look at some of the elements we might need to get in place to get DevOps started in SAP, and how we go about that, and what might be some good levers to try and instigate those programs and bring people on board. And then, as I've mentioned, we're going to look at a couple of customer examples actually, but most specifically, we're going to have a chat to Nicole about the experience of DevOps at Columbia Sportswear before we finish off with a few questions at the end. Just for those of you before we begin who may not be so familiar with Basis Technologies or may not have joined the Basis Technologies webinar before, a quick introduction to the company to explain why we're talking about these topics. As a company, Basis Technologies creates software automation that changes the way our customers can run and manage their SAP systems. And one of the ways we're able to do that is by helping them to bring concepts like DevOps and continuous delivery, which we're going to talk about today, into those SAP environments. And we do that through the most complete DevOps and test automation platform that, very importantly, is specifically engineered for SAP systems. And as I've mentioned, James is going to talk about why that's so important, especially given the difference between SAP and the rest of the IT world. We're very much a global company. James and myself are speaking to you from the UK at the moment, but we have offices in Europe, in North America, and down in Australia as well. And you can see some of the brands and the kind of companies we work with and that our automation supports to help them run their SAP systems more efficiently and more effectively. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to James. And as you can see on the screen there, we're going to kick off with this consideration of why people who don't work in SAP should care about SAP. So James, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Pete. So let's get on with today's webinar. The subject we really want to talk about, and that's how we get to adopt DevOps in our SAP environments. I know a lot of people in our customers and a lot of people on this call today will be familiar with DevOps and have already got quite mature DevOps and CI/CD processes running in their businesses in applications outside SAP, but probably haven't done so inside SAP at all. And I think it's fairly clear that what benefits a DevOps approach can bring to customers and businesses. And if you look at the statistics you see on the screen here from the DORA DevOps report from 2019, we see how much more frequently, how much faster, how much fewer failures we have when we adopt a DevOps approach. So DevOps brings speed, but it also improves quality and reduces risk. And in most organizations I talk to, there is a level of DevOps adoption and CI/CD adoption across some or all of the applications, but often SAP is seen as a bit of an outlier. So if we look at SAP itself and compare it to the rest of IT, on the right-hand side, we've got SAP, which, for those who are not that familiar with, is a key component application to run many businesses. Typically, there would be different types of modules that would run to run things like supply chain, logistics, finance, HR. The very popular module is called ECC. And that is soon, in the next few years, to be replaced by the latest platform run on an in-memory database called S/4HANA. But these applications are typically huge and massively important to businesses. And as such, SAP operates in very different ways and has done traditionally. So they're still using, in many cases, a waterfall development approach. They wouldn't really understand in many cases what DevOps actually is. And we often find that SAP teams can be quite disconnected from the rest of IT. They're in different departments, run by different people, different teams, different partners, different tools, different methods. And therefore, they would think that DevOps is a difficult thing to do because they are typically running longer release cycles every quarter, every 6 months is traditional. Whereas the rest of IT is delivering stuff every day. They've got these continuous delivery processes that, deliver application change and enhancements and things to the business super frequently with high levels of automation. So we need to understand how we bridge this gap. So if you're approaching SAP from the outside and you're a DevOps professional or an IT professional, you're looking at SAP, you may not even thought about SAP at all. It's just not on your radar. But in this webinar, we're going to explain why you should be thinking about it. You may already have heard of SAP and have heard about the problems, some of which we just talked about, where they think that DevOps adoption is going to be too difficult. We're going to show how it can be solved. Or you may have been tasked, as a number of our customers have been, with bringing DevOps into SAP from the outside to bring all the great benefits you're seeing outside SAP with your current approaches into SAP, but you have no idea how to start. If we look at SAP from the inside, looking out towards DevOps, it's a similar thing. They probably never even thought about DevOps or even heard about DevOps. Or they're in a position where they know they need to change, but they don't know how to change, don't know what to do, or are fearful of change because they're comfortable in the way they're working today. Or they have been mandated to do so by a company-wide initiative that says, let's get agile. So we should care about SAP because, as I mentioned earlier, the business cares. SAP runs some critical business processes and critical business applications. And if we can't get SAP to be responsive, then the business is going to suffer. If we have different processes and teams and tools and everything else in SAP, we're going to have delays and frustration and all sorts of problems across our organization and our IT function. And if we've got this agile manifesto or agile desire within our business to improve the speed with which we can innovate, we need SAP to be part of that, and we need it to be able to adapt at high speed in order to deliver the benefits. And if we can bring DevOps into SAP, there are going to be some meaningful benefits and outcomes, and some of which we will talk about today. So let's think about what might be holding firms back in their approach to SAP and DevOps. So I'm going to focus firstly on these 5 areas. The first being about the architecture and the technology. Why is it different in SAP? Why do we have different tools and a lack of integration in SAP? I'm going to talk a little bit about the way we share a development and code repository within SAP, which is quite different to other applications. The general feeling of risk aversion within the SAP community, and of course the cultural impact of that as well. There's always a culture aspect to any transformation, whether it's in SAP or not, and let's look at what makes SAP a little bit different. So let's talk about architecture and technology first. Now there'll be some mature SAP people in this webinar, so this is for the guys who are not really familiar with SAP. But in an SAP system, the code is typically written in a language called ABAP. It's a proprietary SAP language. The whole application is written in ABAP, and it has its uniquenesses. And one of the challenges with SAP is that we can only have one version of a code object that exists in a live system. So this whole concept of canary deployments that we might see in say web developments, where we roll out a change to a subset of users, and if that's okay, it then filters to the rest of the user base, doesn't really work the same in SAP because of the architectural constraints. When we want to deploy a change from a dev to a QA to a production system for customer and end user use, we use this concept of a transport, and that's like a technical container containing all the code and configuration settings that need to be deployed in order for that change to become live. And the concept of a transport is a very unique thing in SAP. And it's fair to say that many organizations running SAP have massive multi-terabyte databases, hugely complex, thousands and thousands of database tables, 20, 30, 40, 50 terabyte systems. They're big. And the challenge with using standard SAP tools, it stops the development community from having all these automated build and test and deployment processes that we see in a DevOps and a CI kind of world. It makes it more difficult for us to coordinate the change of SAP with change of other applications, because we need to harmonize those. And it makes visibility a problem, because we can't easily see what each of these different teams and domains is working on. We have a tooling challenge. Again, back to my chasm. SAP's sitting on the right. It uses proprietary tools to manage development and its language and its deployment and all this kind of stuff. And those tools don't work with applications outside SAP. And if we look on the left-hand side, we look at the likes of Jenkins for automating our builds, and Git and GitLab and these kind of tools for managing our code repositories and all this kind of stuff. Until recently, they didn't work with SAP either. But a lot of the typical DevOps and automation tools and delivery tools don't support the deployment of SAP change. So how do we solve this problem? How do we integrate across this chasm so that we can harmonize our delivery across all these different applications? I mentioned before the shared development system. This is a real constraint for a lot of SAP teams, because in large organizations, you might have hundreds or even thousands of people all developing and operating in the same development system. My ECC development system that's running my supply chain and my logistics and my finance and everything is all running in this one development box, all being maintained in this one development box. And if I make a code change, I'm affecting the code across every single one of those 1,000 developers or configurers. So what happens if I need to put in a production fix that needs to go now, and I'm working on a development that isn't going to be ready for 3 weeks? I'm going to have a problem. I might have to back out some code change. I might be locking an object that is required for for another change, and I'm going to delay that change. And then I have to worry about sequencing and dependencies between all these different transports and objects. And that becomes a challenge. And this is what some of the automation tools in SAP help to overcome. One way of achieving some level of workaround for this is to have a parallel multi-track development approach, whereby we'd have a separate dev, QA, pre-production, possibly in production system for our business as usual, our maintenance, our bug fix and small enhancements track. And then we'd have a one or more N+1 or N+N parallel dev and QA systems to allow us to do project development discreetly in parallel with our bug fixes. So that solves the problem in some way, but it does add complexity because we have to think about merging all the changes, and it also adds cost because each of these systems potentially is big and therefore can be quite expensive to run and host. We have this risk aversion that I mentioned before. You know, the DevOps mantra would be, let's deliver quickly, let's deliver frequently, let's get change to the business as fast as we can. SAP might say, hey, but you can't break my production system. You break my production system, my business stops, my factory stops, I can't sell things to my customers. So I've got to really understand how we overcome this. And you might think with DevOps adoption and faster delivery, you're going to introduce risk. It's pretty well proven that risk comes down with a DevOps approach because of the greater control and visibility and automation and lack of human input into it through manual processes. So the risk will actually come down. And then the last thing is about culture. As I mentioned before, any adoption of any kind of transformation requires people to get on board. We need to think about cultural changes. But in SAP, you know, I've worked in SAP for over 25 years now. I know how SAP works and I know how SAP people work. We're seriously ingrained in the way we operate. And if we start talking about CI/CD and Git and build pipelines and all these kind of things, a lot of SAP diehards are going to look at you as if you're an alien. So we have to be mindful of the culture change in SAP, and it's probably going to be a little bit harder again for SAP to change culture than it would be for other applications because of the ingrained way we've always done it. So let's have a look at how we could get started with DevOps for SAP. So those who have been on my previous webinars would have seen a version of this slide before, and there are three key areas that we need to be looking at. One is process, one is people, one is technology. So I have seen a real move towards agile development within the SAP community, and it's been quite successful, where we've got our prioritized backlog of requirements, regular sprints, daily stand-ups to review progress, all that kind of stuff, and that works quite well. But being agile does not mean you're DevOps. Being agile means I can develop stuff in a good way, but how do I make sure it gets safely delivered and tested? And that's where DevOps helps to come in. We've got to think about the people and the culture. We've already talked about that, but we have to break down those silos. We have to break down that wall between the rest of IT and the SAP team. You know, I was speaking to a customer only a few weeks ago who said, our digital team doesn't speak to SAP. We don't even know who they are. We don't know the names of the people. Never mind we haven't talked to them. There's a real disconnect between them. We have to break that down. We have to work together to deliver change and deliver business outcomes. And of course, tooling is vitally important here because we have to build in high levels of automation, automated builds, automated tests, automated deployments. And we have to make sure that those tools are integrated so that we can get the most out of our end-to-end processes. So how do we go about making a case for DevOps adoption in our organizations? And the four things here are the kind of feedback that we've had from our customers of some of the challenges that they've had and the success they've had and the success they've had with getting the message across into their organizations about DevOps and SAP. One of them is speed, of course. One of the biggest drivers for this is the fact that SAP releases are too slow. We can't wait a month or 2 months or 3 months for a change when I want to deliver a business requirement tomorrow or next week that takes me 1 day to build in my web store. So we have to solve that. And if we can demonstrate how an increase in application delivery speed will transform the business and the success of the business, you're onto a winner. I've mentioned integration a number of times here. We have to make sure that our tools are integrated. We have to make sure that, for example, when I'm deploying across applications and I say now go and trigger a deployment, that's going to trigger a deployment across all the systems, including SAP. SAP is not left behind. It's that the tools running SAP are integrated into this DevOps and build pipeline. We have to create the visibility in order to get the culture and the teamwork working together so that we've all got visibility, we've all got the same view of what is the current state and what is the truth. And that's going to massively help collaboration across teams. You know, people are going to be working with new people who've got different backgrounds, different tool sets, different skill sets. Anything you can do to improve that communication is going to help. And of course, security. We cannot underestimate the importance of security. And this process really helps us bring security to the forefront, bring in the safeguards we need to improve the protection for our systems and businesses. So how can we get started? Now, I've run webinars where the entire contents of the webinars is focusing on the steps you might take. So we can't cover everything in detail today, but the first thing we need to do is start to talk to each other. Yeah, we need to jump over that wall, knock it down, and start the dialogue between our teams so we can understand the difference of approach, understand where the constraints are, understand how the different tools might be able to talk to each other. And the success we normally see is where we can choose a smaller, safer project, prove that there is success there, be allowed to fail, be allowed to mess it up, go again, improve, and then evolve from there. And then you've got something to baseline your success around and say, hey, that team did it that way. I want to follow what they're doing because it's better. I mentioned about bringing teams together, but it's important we do it around business outcomes. We have to deliver business requirements, and that could be across 2, 3, 4, 10 different applications. If SAP is one of them, we have to get the SAP guys and all the other associated application people working together around their particular business areas, whether that's supply chain or an order to cash process or an expense process, whatever it is, the business outcome is important. We have to think about the right SAP automation tools. Not all automation tools are equal. They don't all have the same functionality and indeed integration capabilities, per the last point on there, to enable us to get this harmonized end-to-end process in place. So tool selection is important, and how we integrate those is equally important. And if you can do this, if you can achieve this, then the results are very compelling. So that what you see on the screen here is the results that our customers have fed back to us in their successful stories of how they've adopted much greater agility through DevOps adoption. And we can see how much more efficient things are, how faster we can deliver to the business, how much less risk there is of bringing our systems down if we put the right tools and processes and culture in place. So I'm just going to focus on a couple of real world examples here. We have Nicole from Colombia who will have a bit of dialogue with Pete to discuss their particular story. But first of all, I wanted to introduce the solutions that they will talk about and another example story of somebody who's done this very thing that I've been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so. So first of all, this is the Basis Technologies DevOps platform. It's supported by 2 key products, Active Control, firstly, which is all around automating our change and development process, all about delivering change in an automated way, integrating into all these different tool sets that we've talked about, integrating into ABAP Git, into Jenkins build pipelines, all this kind of stuff, and safely managing the deployment and the dependencies and all those kind of important things. And then Testimony it's all about automated regression testing. The more we deliver, the faster we deliver, the more frequently we deliver, the more important testing becomes. You can't do it manually. You have to automate that. So the combination of these two products helps our customers to deliver change in a rapid, automated, and safe way. And one of those customers is Ericsson. Now, Ericsson are a well-known telecom company. They're one of the world's biggest telecommunication infrastructure providers in the world. And they wanted a solution primarily to accelerate their SAP change because it was suffering from a lot of the problems we've talked about today. So they had a general IT agenda to move to a continuous delivery model, a DevOps model, across all their different applications. And they identified 15 frequently changed applications that served many different business functions, of which SAP was one. But the challenge was that most of those applications were, evolved to a CI/CD approach using a tool called GitLab, which is like a Git and Jenkins kind of pipeline tool all rolled into one. But SAP wasn't involved in this because it has its own proprietary tools. It had its own team. They didn't talk to each other, and therefore SAP was seen as a big blocker. All the problems I've talked about up to now, this company was seeing. So what they did was implemented active control, and they selected active control. One of the primary reasons was to allow it to integrate into a DevOps process, so that then they were able to harmonize both the SAP delivery, their agile development processes, and their non-SAP delivery pipeline all into one end-to-end integrated process. Indeed, they even decided to go multiple N+10, in some cases, environments using containerized SAP systems to bring down the speed and infrastructure requirements, so that they could actually give a discrete development and QA system to a Scrum team to develop in isolation, and then they merged everything through in the end into the central dev system afterwards. A little bit like a Git process would be, but on a slightly smaller scale. And what this allowed them to do through the control of active control to manage the deployment of change across their environment and the integration into their non-SAP delivery solution and GitLab was to bring daily multi-application delivery processes, including SAP. And ultimately, this delivered a much faster response to their business and their customers. And this is what it's all about. It's about creating a much more simple and speedy delivery process for our application changes. So I'm now going to hand over to Nicole and Pete, who are now going to discuss the journey that Columbia Sportswear have taken in their adoption of DevOps processes for SAP. So over to you guys.
All right, thanks very much, James, and thanks for that overview, and obviously a very interesting example there with Ericsson in their specific line of business and their approach. But we're seeing this across all kinds of different industries, the pressure to change, the pressure to be more responsive and to adapt more quickly. And as I say, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk with Nicole Alstelot now from Columbia Sportswear about their experience in a quite different field from that Ericsson example we've just looked at. So Nicole, thanks again for joining us. I know you're not, let's say, 100% only dyed-in-the-wool SAP in your background. Just tell us a bit about yourself and how you've come to be in your current role in Columbia before we get started.
Thanks for having me today. I have been involved with SAP for over 20 years. I started as a technical basis support person and kind of maneuvered my way through operations and release management. I came to Columbia as a release manager for non-SAP applications and ended up taking over SAP shortly after I started back in 2011. So for the last 8 years, I've been supporting both SAP and non-SAP from a change and release perspective. So I have a unique blend with my background of how SAP technically works and how Columbia has implemented it to integrate with all of our non-SAP systems to support our enterprise applications.
Okay, great. And I think it's certainly interesting to talk to somebody who's kind of got that foot in both camps, you know, as we've been talking about people outside SAP and that viewing from the outside during this webinar. So before we talk specifically about SAP at Columbia, I'm sure most people are familiar with the brand. I know I've got some things with this logo on in my house, but just give us the quick introduction to what Columbia Sportswear is as a company, what you guys do, who you are.
We're headquartered in Portland, Oregon, and under our Columbia umbrella, we have 4 brands. Columbia is our main brand. We also have Sorel, Mountain Hardwear, and Prana. Columbia and Sorel are based out of our Portland headquarters, and Mountain Hardwear has a headquarters in the Bay Area in California, and Prana is currently based out of Southern California. We are a global company. We have global users all over the world. We have distribution centers in North America and Europe. And our current IS team that supports all of our enterprise applications is about 300 people, with 40 of them dedicated specifically to SAP.
Okay, so we're talking, you know, we're talking decent scale here. Let's look at SAP. Let's talk to SAP. I think we've got a graphic which speaks a little bit to the journey you guys have been on as a company. Explain to us how SAP fits in with Columbia's landscape, as I say, the journey that you've been on, and how critical your SAP systems are to your business today.
SAP is our ERP system. We purchased it in late 2010 and started our journey in 2011 by building our teams. Over the course of about 6 years, we did regional rollouts. We started in Canada and we finished in Europe. During that time, Columbia's release of SAP and the regional rollouts drove our entire release calendar. So we did annual implementations, where I know Peter had said that some of the SAP implementations run every 2 to 4 months. Ours was a lot longer in duration between our big releases. After we finished our final regional implementation in 2018, we kind of went into continuous improvement and enhancement mode. We upgraded SAP in 2019, and we also purchased Active Control in Q4 of last year. And then we moved off of Solution Manager into Active Control for our change management processes in February of this year. So we're a new implementation on Active Control. SAP itself integrates with about 40 other systems to support our enterprise activities. We integrate through both modern and legacy technologies. We've got a mix of on-prem, SaaS, and other cloud-based solutions. So we really run the gamut of trying to support from cradle to grave through our SAP system.
Okay, so I mean, in many ways, a perfect example of what James was talking about there, with a set of systems that the business is really going to be relying on in a variety of different ways. And you mentioned Active Control being relatively new in Columbia, and I know part of the reason that you've adopted that and changed the tooling and the way you're working is to do with this idea of being more agile. And Columbia had a broader DevOps project and a focus on DevOps outside of SAP for some time, I believe. Why was that? What's happening in the market that was kind of changing the way that people were thinking in IT broadly across Columbia about how they work?
I think a lot of it came from the way that our consumers are interacting with the retail industry today. We started off solely focused on brick and mortar, and over the last couple of years, we have upped our presence and ramped up our support of our e-com channels, which means we have to be able to adapt to the consumer marketplace in a much faster way than we ever have in the past. E-com at Columbia is a separate organization outside of IS. So there's some unique challenges there that we need to overcome to partner with that organization. And one of them was we just needed to be able to adapt faster. So we had some internal pressure from IS as well as some external pressure from both different teams outside of IS and just the consumer marketplace to be able to keep up with demand.
So very much a business focus, as James has said, in terms of looking at the outcomes you need to deliver rather than IT for technical sake, if you like.
Correct.
And so when there was some DevOps adoption outside of SAP in Columbia, and you're having these conversations about being more agile and how you can be more responsive, was there kind of a trigger point that said, you know, we really need to make a change in SAP and change the way we're working and look at DevOps as an approach here? Or was there just kind of more a combination of factors that was building up to the point where that had to happen?
I think it was a combination of factors that really kind of took off in 2019, early in the year. Our delivery engineering team that was chartered to go implement a DevOps mindset, we would get questions, and they weren't SAP folks. So we would get questions like, well, just tell me what table that data exists in, and I'll just go pull the data. And from an SAP perspective, there's hundreds of thousands of tables in SAP. So it's not just one table. And that was a really hard concept to sell to an engineer working outside of SAP. I think the other question that we got a lot was, well, what do you mean you can't do branching in your code in your dev environment? You can only have one version of the code? So just the whole education process internally to bridge that gap between our delivery engineering non-SAP teams and our engineering team supporting SAP, we spent a lot of time on that last year.
And how far do you feel you've got down that road? Is there still plenty of work to do in terms of educating that team, or do you feel that they've now got a better understanding of the challenges that you guys face in the SAP world?
I feel that they've got a better understanding from the delivery engineering side, and our SAP teams also have a better understanding of the capabilities outside of SAP. They're learning more and starting to implement more through a service model architecture. So it's really, it's a fun journey to watch happen as both teams evolve and come together to create those integrations and create those working relationships that will enable them both to be successful and move faster.
Fantastic. And so very much a real example of that kind of collaboration and cross-pollination that James is talking about. I know you're, let's say, relatively early on this DevOps journey within SAP specifically, but you've moved to become more agile. You've made changes in the way you're working to align with the rest of the business. What kind of outcomes are you seeing so far, and where do you see this journey going next in terms of SAP and how you guys are working?
One of the things for me personally that has been a huge win, I was a single point of support for all of the change management within SAP. Before we implemented Active Control, we were doing deployments to production twice a week, and they took about 8 hours total to support across 7 different development and technical teams. Within 2 days of implementing Active Control, we moved to daily deployments Monday through Friday, and they take less than a half an hour over the course of a week to get that ready. And it's also become an automated activity where before Basis was having to manually coordinate and import all of our changes. So we've already eliminated about 7 hours of work across those teams to enable them to dedicate that 7 hours somewhere else. By deploying 5 days a week, we get to deploy when ready. So teams don't have to wait an additional 2 days just because we're only doing deployments twice a week.
And do you have you got much feedback yet from the business in terms of how this impacts them and whether they appreciate that this change is happening?
The business really likes it because they get features and enhancements and value delivered to them faster, and they're able to get quicker wins and quicker returns on the investment, where in the past it could have taken a week or 2 weeks to get something turned around. Now we can do it in a matter of days.
So, I mean, it sounds like been a real positive experience so far on that DevOps journey in SAP. Is that more agile approach, that DevOps path, something that you'd recommend to other SAP teams in terms of how they can support the business and also make their own lives easier?
Absolutely. What we've seen by going to Active Control is that we have better visibility to what's coming through the pipeline. We have better reporting for troubleshooting in the if we have to go back and look at when something was deployed and who deployed it. We have better organization capabilities. We moved off of Solution Manager, which I supported, and it just didn't give us what we needed to manage the business. So Active Control has completely opened our eyes and enabled our teams to move faster.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I wish we had more time, but we've got to wrap it up there so we can move on and finish the session. Nicole, thanks again so much for joining us. Really appreciate your input in today's session.
Thank you.
And we will be planning to run a more detailed look at Columbia Sportswear's experience with DevOps and DevOps for SAP later on in the year. So if you're interested in learning more about that, do keep an eye out on the Basis Technologies website and on our email communications for more information on that webinar when it's scheduled. So yeah, thanks again to Nicole for that. Just moving on now to wrap up the session and summarize some of the things we've looked at. Just a final look here on today's topic about looking at SAP from the outside in from a DevOps perspective. To recap that point about why DevOps professionals should care about SAP. As James mentioned earlier on, very much the core of that is because the business cares and because the business needs that support in order to be more efficient and more effective. But there are some more particular reasons as well why DevOps professionals can get some benefit from thinking about SAP. So first of all, let's just run through these quickly. We've got an easier life written there, and fundamentally, I think Nicole's given a great example of what we mean by that in terms of how automation and integration into other teams and workflows can make delivery of software much easier, smoother, and take a lot of time out of the process that frankly is going to make for a much easier life in terms of being effective and supporting the business. We've also got this question of personal reputation, and that key question there of why has no one done this before? And we hear that often when people are adopting agile ways of working and automation like Active Control in terms of the impact it can have really, really quickly in terms of productivity, effort, stress, and also, as I mentioned a number of times, delivering value to the business. So it can be a real boon to be the person who's kind of driving this project. Strategic alignment, really important from a longer term planning perspective, making sure SAP isn't an island and can be integrated with overall planning and therefore effective outcomes. You're going to have happier business users if you can deliver more frequently, more quickly, more safely in SAP and align that with other applications in the business. And ultimately, what we hope that's going to ladder up to is more satisfied customers in terms of how you can respond to their needs in terms of your product, your support, or your offer. And overall, what we're all aiming to achieve here in DevOps for SAP and elsewhere in integrating that strategic IT approach is business competitiveness and success and differentiation from the competition that's out there in terms of agility and responsiveness. So SAP is a key part of those business processes and definitely something we should be considering when we're thinking about DevOps. So just to wrap up today's session, summary of what we've talked about. As I've said, DevOps professionals really should be considering SAP, but importantly, both DevOps and SAP teams, if they're discrete, can benefit from greater collaboration, cross-pollination of ideas and sharing skills. And again, Nicole gave a great example of that in the situation at Columbia Sportswear, where the teams are working more closely together. James has covered how a standard DevOps approach won't work in SAP. You can't just lift and shift exactly what you've done elsewhere because of these things like architectural differences and tooling differences. But DevOps is very much achievable in SAP today. The benefits are real. We've given a couple of examples of organizations that have done that and are at different stages in the journey, but many of them are beginning and they are reaping the benefits of greater agility and of implementation of DevOps in their SAP systems. So that's it for today's session. Just to repeat, we have recorded today's session. We will be sending a link to the recording to everybody who is registered if you want to review any of today's content. You can also see some contact details on the screen there for our website and for James's email if you have any questions that you'd like to follow up offline or maybe talk about what our product could potentially do in supporting DevOps in your organization. So do please feel free to get in touch at any time if you'd like to know more. Now, in the meantime, we've had a couple of questions have come in, so we'll wrap up the session as we always do, just looking at a little bit of Q&A before we close out for today. We've got a couple of things here, both for Nicole and for James. James, one for you to start with. We had a question, just paraphrasing here, but is it necessary to do Scrum or Agile in order to do DevOps, or is it possible to do it through a waterfall or more traditional method and still get some of those benefits?
I mean, ideally, you would evolve your process, but I think regardless of what the maturity of your process, and let's realize that this is a journey. You're not going to just be waterfall today and then DevOps tomorrow. It might take you many months or even years to get everything embedded so it's absolutely singing. But if you put in the right kind of automation technology, even if you're using more traditional methods, if you can automate your deployments and automate your testing, or automate your dependency checks and all these, and your impact assessments and all these different things, you're still going to be able to deliver some significant benefits, because that level of automation will not only help you improve the speed, it will also help you reduce the risk of some of your deployments. And many of our customers have used our solutions in a waterfall way for many, many years. Active Control has been around for over 20 years in some kind of guises. So yeah, the maturity of your approach will benefit the whole end-to-end process, but you can certainly have quick wins if you evolve bits of it at different speeds.
Well, actually, yeah, just on that note, and you may have covered this here, but just in case you have anything else to add, there was a question around, are there any kind of key quick wins that you can get through adopting DevOps, which possibly could help to support that case that you want to make?
Yeah, I mean, what I found is by having better development processes where you've got things like peer reviews. We introduced code peer reviews many years ago, and it was one of the #1 things that we did that will help us improve our code quality, making sure you shift left as many of those checks and balances into the early stages of your development process. These are things, and as I mentioned, if you can automate your deployment of change and make sure that all these different transports that we mentioned earlier are being successfully delivered and having visibility across all the different requirements. I think Nicole was saying how they benefited from having greater visibility and much less work to do because things are automated. These will help you go some way towards evolving your processes, even as you're then evolving your cultural change, your team change, and your process changes.
Okay, thanks for that. Just a question for Nicole here. We talked about integration with tool chains. What's your view in Colombia? Longer term, do you plan to integrate your SAP change and release processes with a more broad pipeline? Is that something you're working towards?
Yeah, we're currently using Azure DevOps for our non-SAP changes, and so there is a look down the road to how do we integrate those two systems together so that we have a cross-functional visibility. We're also going to be integrating it to our ITSM system so that it feeds into our enterprise change and release management. And we currently have a project that just kicked off to build automated test cases for our SAP changes so that we can enable automated testing in the future.
But would it be fair to say that although those kind of additions are going to be beneficial, they're not strictly a requirement? Just thinking about that idea about quick wins in terms of getting started, you've already seen benefit today just through adoption of more automation and more cross-team collaboration.
That is very true. Our teams, I think, are better able to talk to each other and understand where each other's coming from because we've spent time to do the education at a foundational level of what SAP looks like, what are the potential opportunities within SAP, and then how do we align those with the opportunities that we're seeing outside of our SAP environments.
Okay, cool, thanks. James, one back for you, and kind of in a similar theme here, but in your experience, how long does it take to get going with DevOps and SAP? How quick can we get started? How big is the change?
It's not to be underestimated because there's a lot to do. And we've mentioned, some of the quick wins that we can achieve. We don't want to try and achieve everything all at once. And I think if we can identify an area there where that's safe to prove your process, prove your improvements, take an environment, a system, a project or whatever, to prove a new process and to demonstrate success. I think you're not going to get it right first time. Even moving towards a more of an agile development approach, you don't get it right first time. You have to be allowed to fail. You have to be allowed to measure and understand your failure, go again, fix things, and iterate. So, if I look at the Ericsson example, for example, I think their journey was pretty quick. I think it was certainly within a number of months to get from where they were to having everything running and integrated. But even then, there are improvements that they're making. So it does depend on the kind of organization, the size of your landscape, the size of your teams, and how many different applications, and the general attitude to change and innovation within your organization. But I would say you're talking a minimum of months, up until maybe a couple of years to get everything absolutely running perfectly.
But as we've said, and Nicole's given a great example there, that's going to be a journey. You're going to start to accrue benefits presumably throughout that time. You're not waiting for 6 months or a year to see an improvement.
Absolutely, you can have improvements up and running within weeks if you can get some of the appropriate tooling in place, for example, or if you start evolving your process, or you get your teams working better together. Even if they're just working together and communicating, you're automatically going to have improvements there. So there will be cumulative updates and cumulative improvements across all the elements we've talked about, which ultimately deliver greater benefit as time goes by.
Okay, thanks for that. We're a bit over time here. There's one final question I want to get in because it's something you've touched on, and I know it's something we've been looking at as an organisation and presented on. One of our attendees asked about technologies like GCTS from SAP, and obviously that relates to things like ABAP Git, and how they might impact this DevOps approach in SAP. Can you just briefly share your opinion in terms of what you're seeing in that kind of direction in terms of Git-based development for SAP?
Yeah, well, in fact, last year at TechEd, we presented how an ABAP Git-based approach, coupled with Jenkins and Active Control, could revolutionize SAP development. And ever since then, we've seen a big uptake from our customers who want to adopt some of these approaches. Because I mean, this is the way people operate today outside SAP. We work in our own discrete development environments. We've got a code base on our laptops rather than sharing a development system with 100 or 200 or 500 different people. There's no reason why you can't do that in SAP now. And in fact, it's what we are doing internally in the development of our Active Control product. We're already using ABAP Git to develop and seeing some massive improvements in the way we can deliver and merge code. So yeah, this is something that's going to mature rapidly, I think, over the next year to 2 years. But we're already ready. We're already delivering. We've got a release of Active Control coming out, which will actually deliver inbuilt ABAP Git integration and Jenkins integration for people who are interested in that.
Okay, brilliant. Well, we're going to have to leave it there because, as I say, we are slightly over time. Apologies to anybody who sent in a question that we didn't have time to address today, but thanks to everybody for joining us. Do keep an eye out for future Basis Technologies webinars. We usually have a monthly program, and we'll be looking forward to some more exciting conversations in the next few months with end users in terms of how DevOps and test automation has helped them run their SAP systems. But for today, thanks very much for joining us.